The therapist who broke confidentiality is why my son is still alive. The call came from Dr. Lillian Foster on a Wednesday evening while I was heating up frozen pizza for dinner. She introduced herself as my son Ethan's therapist and said she needed to meet with me immediately, tonight if possible, without my wife Rebecca present. Her voice had an edge that made my stomach drop. I asked what this was about, and she said she couldn't discuss it over the phone, but it concerned Ethan's safety, and she'd already filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. My hands went numb holding the phone. I told her I could be at her office in 40 minutes. She gave me the address and said to come to the back entrance, not the front. The secrecy felt wrong, but the urgency in her voice left no room for argument. I told Rebecca I had to run an errand and would be back soon. She was in the living room scrolling through her phone and barely looked up when I left. The drive to Dr. Foster's office felt surreal, traffic lights and street signs blurring past while my mind raced through possibilities. Ethan had been seeing her for 3 months since Rebecca and I separated in June. The divorce was supposed to be amicable, but things had gotten complicated when she filed for primary custody, claiming I was emotionally absent and prioritized work over family. Dr. Foster met me at the back door of her office building, a plain brick structure in a medical complex near the hospital. She was in her mid-50s with gray hair pulled back and glasses that reflected the parking lot lights. She led me through empty hallways to her office without small talk. The room had soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged around a coffee table, the kind of space designed to make people feel safe enough to reveal painful truths. She gestured for me to sit and close the door firmly. She said she was violating confidentiality laws by meeting with me and could lose her license, but she believed Ethan's life was in danger and standard protocols weren't moving fast enough. I started to ask what she meant, but she held up her hand and said I needed to listen carefully to everything before responding. She explained that during their sessions over the past month, Ethan had disclosed troubling information about his home life with Rebecca. He described being given medicine that made him sick, being kept home from school frequently, and being told he had serious health problems that required constant monitoring. Dr. Foster had grown concerned when Ethan mentioned Rebecca taking him to different doctors in different cities, always seeking diagnoses for illnesses he didn't seem to actually have. Dr. Foster pulled out a file folder and opened it on the coffee table. Inside were her session notes, carefully documented dates and statements from Ethan. She pointed to an entry from 3 weeks ago where Ethan told her Rebecca had been researching rare childhood diseases online and asking him questions about his symptoms before doctor appointments. Another note described Ethan saying his mother gave him special vitamins that made his stomach hurt and caused him to vomit. Dr. Foster had initially considered the possibility that Ethan was exaggerating due to divorce stress, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. She showed me medical records she'd obtained through a release form Rebecca had signed when starting therapy. Ethan had been to 14 different doctors in 8 months. He'd undergone blood tests, imaging scans, and evaluations for conditions ranging from autoimmune disorders to cardiac problems. Every test came back normal, but Rebecca kept seeking new opinions and insisting something was seriously wrong with him. Dr. Foster said the pattern matched Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a form of abuse where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care, usually for attention or sympathy. The realization hit me like cold water. I remembered Rebecca posting about Ethan's health struggles on social media, sharing updates about doctor visits and test results, receiving hundreds of supportive comments. I asked why she was telling me this instead of just letting CPS handle it. Dr. Foster leaned forward, and her expression darkened. She said CPS had assigned the case to investigator Patricia Webb, who happened to be friends with Rebecca's sister. She'd filed the mandatory report 4 days ago and received a call back from Webb saying she'd looked into it and found no cause for concern. Webb claimed she'd spoken with Rebecca and reviewed medical records and determined that Rebecca was simply being a concerned mother seeking proper diagnosis for legitimate health issues. Dr. Foster said she'd pushed back, explaining the pattern of doctor shopping and Ethan's own statements, but Webb had dismissed her concerns and closed the case. That's when Dr. Foster made copies of everything and started reaching out to other professionals. She'd contacted 3 of the doctors who'd examined Ethan and asked if they'd been given complete medical histories. 2 of them said Rebecca had specifically told them Ethan hadn't seen other specialists, when in fact he'd been evaluated by multiple doctors for the same symptoms. The deliberate withholding of information suggested Rebecca was manipulating the medical system to get the diagnoses she wanted. Dr. Foster had filed complaints with the state medical board and contacted an attorney specializing in child welfare cases. But all of that would take time, and she believed Ethan was in immediate danger. She showed me text messages Ethan had sent her through a therapy app meant for patients to communicate between sessions. The messages were short and scared. Mom gave me the white pills again. I threw up 3 times. Can I stay with Dad? Another message from 5 days ago said Mom told the new doctor I have seizures, but I don't think I do. I feel fine when I'm at Dad's house. Dr. Foster said she'd asked Ethan directly if his symptoms only appeared at his mother's house, and he'd confirmed that he felt completely healthy during his weekends with me. She'd documented everything meticulously, building a case that would be hard to dismiss. But she needed me to take immediate action, because CPS wasn't going to protect him. She said I needed to file for emergency custody and get Ethan away from Rebecca before she escalated. Dr. Foster explained that people with Munchausen by proxy often increase the severity of abuse when they feel scrutinized or when their actions are questioned. If Rebecca suspected anyone was investigating her, she might do something drastic to prove Ethan was actually sick. Cases existed where mothers had poisoned their children or induced medical emergencies to validate their claims. I felt sick thinking about how many times I'd dismissed Rebecca's concerns as maternal anxiety, how many doctor appointments I'd missed because I trusted her to handle Ethan's health care. I asked what I should do first. Dr. Foster handed me a business card for an attorney named Jeffrey Brennan, who specialized in emergency custody cases. She said she'd already spoken with him and sent over her documentation. He was expecting my call and would file the emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning. She also gave me contact information for Dr. Philip Torres, a pediatrician who'd examined Ethan twice and had concerns about the contradictory information Rebecca provided. Dr. Torres had kept detailed notes about Rebecca's behavior during appointments, including her apparent disappointment when tests came back normal. Dr. Foster said I needed to document everything from this point forward, keep Ethan safe, and trust that the evidence would speak for itself in court. She apologized for violating confidentiality, but said she'd rather lose her license than have Ethan's death on her conscience. Her words made everything real in a way that terrified me. My son's life was in danger from his own mother, and the system designed to protect him had already failed once. I thanked her and promised to call the attorney immediately. She walked me back to the rear entrance and told me to be careful. She said people who commit this type of abuse are often charming and convincing, and Rebecca would likely fight back hard if she realized what was happening. I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Jeffrey Brennan's number. He answered on the second ring, despite it being almost 8 hours at night. I explained who I was, and he said Dr. Foster had briefed him on the situation. He asked me to come to his office right now if possible, because we needed to file paperwork before court opened tomorrow morning. His office was 15 minutes away in a professional building downtown. I drove there feeling disconnected from reality, processing the fact that my wife had been systematically abusing our son while I'd been oblivious. Jeffrey's office was small but organized, law books lining the walls and case files stacked neatly on his desk. He was in his early 40s, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. He already had documents pulled up on his computer screen. He said emergency custody motions required clear evidence of imminent danger, and fortunately Dr. Foster's documentation provided exactly that. He walked me through the legal process while typing rapidly. We'd file the motion in family court tomorrow morning requesting immediate temporary custody pending a full hearing. The judge would review Dr. Foster's session notes, the medical records showing Dr. Shopping, and Ethan's own statements. Jeffrey said most judges took these cases very seriously because the potential for harm was so high. He asked me detailed questions about Rebecca's behavior over the past year. I told him about her increasing focus on Ethan's health, the constant doctor appointments, the social media posts documenting his supposed medical journey. I mentioned that she'd started a fundraising page to help with medical expenses, even though our insurance covered everything. Jeffrey's expression sharpened, and he asked how much money she'd raised. I checked my phone and pulled up the fundraising page. It showed $43,000 in donations from friends, family, and strangers who'd read Rebecca's emotional posts about our son's mysterious illness. Jeffrey said that added another dimension to the case, because financial gain could be a motivating factor. People with Munchausen by proxy often received secondary benefits beyond attention, including money, social status, or special treatment. The fundraising page provided a clear financial incentive for Rebecca to maintain the narrative that Ethan was seriously ill. Jeffrey took screenshots of everything and incorporated it into the emergency motion. He said we'd have a hearing tomorrow afternoon if the judge agreed there was urgency. I'd need to bring any evidence I had of Ethan being healthy at my house, any communications from Rebecca about his health, and any witnesses who could testify about the situation. I thought about my sister Lauren, who'd commented several times that Ethan seemed perfectly fine when she saw him, which had annoyed Rebecca. Jeffrey said we'd call her as a witness if needed. He finished drafting the motion around 10:30 and printed multiple copies for me to sign. The document laid out everything Dr. Foster had discovered, cited specific instances of medical abuse, and requested that Ethan be placed in my custody immediately while the court investigated. Jeffrey said he'd file it electronically tonight and hand-deliver a copy to the courthouse clerk first thing in the morning. He'd also notify the judge's chambers that we were requesting an emergency hearing. He told me to go home and act normal, not to confront Rebecca or give any indication that legal action was coming. If she suspected anything, she might flee with Ethan or do something dangerous. I drove home trying to process everything. When I walked in, Rebecca was still on the couch and Ethan was in his room. I checked on him and found him reading a book in bed. He looked small and fragile in a way that made my chest ache. I asked how he was feeling and he said fine, but his eyes darted toward the hallway where Rebecca was. I told him I loved him and things were going to get better soon. He nodded, but didn't seem convinced. I went to bed that night lying next to Rebecca, knowing she'd been poisoning our son and wondering how I'd missed all the signs. Sleep was impossible. The next morning I went to work and tried to focus while waiting for Jeffrey to call. He texted me at 9:47 that the motion had been filed and the judge had agreed to an emergency hearing at 2 hours that afternoon. Rebecca would be notified by court personnel within the hour. My phone rang at 10:23 with Rebecca's number. I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times before leaving a message. Her voice was shaking with anger. She said she'd just been served with emergency custody papers and couldn't believe I was doing this to her and Ethan. She said I was trying to destroy their relationship because I couldn't handle the stress of having a sick child. She demanded I call her back immediately. I forwarded the voicemail to Jeffrey, who said her reaction was typical of someone whose control was being threatened. He told me not to engage with her at all before the hearing. At 1:30, I met Jeffrey at the courthouse. Dr. Foster was already there, along with Dr. Torres, the pediatrician. Jeffrey had subpoenaed Dr. Torres to testify about Rebecca's behavior during medical appointments. We waited in a small conference room until we were called into the courtroom. Judge Patricia Osmond presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for games. Rebecca sat at the opposite table with her attorney, a man named Douglas Crane, who looked expensive and overconfident. Judge Osmond reviewed the emergency motion and asked Jeffrey to present his case. He called Dr. Foster to the stand first. She testified about Ethan's disclosures during therapy sessions, the pattern of symptoms that only appeared at Rebecca's house, and the concerning frequency of doctor visits for conditions that never materialized. She explained her decision to file a CPS report and the subsequent dismissal by investigator Patricia Webb. Judge Osmond's expression darkened at that detail. Dr. Foster presented her session notes with specific quotes from Ethan describing being given medicine that made him sick. Douglas Crane cross-examined her, trying to suggest she was overreaching and misinterpreting a child's statements. He claimed Ethan was simply acting out due to divorce stress and trying to get attention by exaggerating. Dr. Foster remained calm and pointed to the medical records showing 14 different doctors in 8 months. She asked if that seemed like normal behavior for a concerned parent or a pattern of someone shopping for diagnoses. Douglas had no good response. Dr. Torres testified next about the 2 appointments where he'd examined Ethan. He said Rebecca had insisted Ethan had severe abdominal pain and possible seizures, but his examinations found no evidence of either condition. He described how Rebecca seemed disappointed when he said Ethan appeared healthy and how she'd argued with his assessment. Dr. Torres said he'd documented concerns about possible fabricated illness after the second appointment. He'd tried to discuss his concerns with Rebecca, but she'd become defensive and refused to bring Ethan back. He'd noted in his files that he suspected medical child abuse, but had no proof at the time. Judge Osmond asked why he hadn't reported his suspicions to authorities. Dr. Torres said he'd consulted with colleagues and been advised that without concrete evidence, a report would likely go nowhere and could damage his credibility. He regretted not acting sooner. Douglas tried to paint Dr. Torres as judgmental of Rebecca's parenting, but the doctor's detailed notes and professional demeanor made that argument weak. Jeffrey called me to the stand and asked me to describe Ethan's health at my house versus Rebecca's. I testified that during my custody time, Ethan never complained of symptoms and seemed like a completely healthy 12-year-old boy. He ate normally, played video games, went outside, and showed no signs of the serious illnesses Rebecca claimed he had. I described how Rebecca had controlled all medical decisions during our marriage and how I'd trusted her judgment. I admitted I'd been blind to the pattern because I'd been focused on work and hadn't questioned her constant doctor appointments. I testified about the fundraising page and the $43,000 Rebecca had collected while claiming Ethan was seriously ill. Douglas cross-examined me aggressively, suggesting I was fabricating allegations to gain custody and avoid paying child support. He accused me of being an absent father who suddenly wanted involvement only to hurt Rebecca. I stayed calm and said I wanted involvement to protect my son from being poisoned. The word hung in the courtroom. Judge Osmond asked for clarification. Jeffrey stood and said we had reason to believe Rebecca had been administering substances to induce symptoms in Ethan. He requested the court-ordered toxicology testing and a full medical evaluation by an independent physician. Douglas objected loudly, calling the accusation outrageous and defamatory. Rebecca started crying at her table. Judge Osmond silenced everyone and said she'd heard enough for a preliminary ruling. She said the pattern of medical visits, the financial incentive from fundraising, the discrepancies between Ethan's health at each parent's home, and the professional concerns raised by both a therapist and pediatrician created sufficient cause for immediate, protective action. She granted temporary emergency custody to me, effective immediately. Ethan would live with me pending a full evidentiary hearing in 2 weeks. She ordered a complete medical workup by a court-appointed physician, toxicology screening, and a home inspection of both residences. She also ordered CPS to reopen their investigation under a different investigator. Rebecca screamed that I was destroying her life and taking away her son. Judge Osmond warned her to control herself or face contempt charges. Douglas tried to argue for supervised visitation, but the judge denied it. She said until the investigation was complete, Rebecca would have no contact with Ethan. A bailiff would accompany me to Rebecca's house to retrieve Ethan and his belongings. The hearing ended, and Rebecca stared at me with pure hatred. Douglas pulled her into the hallway before she could approach me. Jeffrey said the ruling was exactly what we needed, and to get Ethan immediately. The bailiff drove with me to Rebecca's house. She wasn't home yet, having stayed at the courthouse with her attorney. I used my key to enter and found Ethan in his room doing homework. He looked up surprised when I walked in with the bailiff. I told him to pack a bag because he was coming to stay with me for a while. He asked if this was about therapy, and I said yes. Dr. Foster was helping make sure he stayed safe. Relief flooded his face, and I realized how scared he'd been. He packed clothes and his favorite books while I gathered his school supplies and laptop. The bailiff documented everything to prevent any claims that I'd taken items improperly. We loaded everything into my car and drove to my apartment. That evening, I made dinner while Ethan sat at the kitchen counter. He was quiet, processing the sudden change. I told him that Dr. Foster had explained to me what had been happening with the medicine and the doctors. His eyes filled with tears, and he said he didn't want to get his mom in trouble, but he was scared and didn't know what to do. I held him and promised he'd never have to take those pills again. He cried into my shoulder and said sometimes his mom would get angry if he said he felt fine, so he'd learn to act sicker to make her happy. The manipulation broke my heart. He said he'd tried to tell me before, but I was always busy, and his mom said I didn't care about his health problems. I apologized for not seeing what was happening sooner. He asked if his mom would go to jail, and I said I didn't know yet. But right now, the most important thing was keeping him safe. We spent the evening watching movies and talking about school and normal things. He fell asleep on the couch, and I carried him to the guest room that would now be his room. I stayed awake, researching Munchausen syndrome by proxy, reading case studies that made my stomach turn. Most victims were young children whose parents had subjected them to unnecessary medical procedures, sometimes for years before anyone intervened. The court-appointed physician, Dr. Angela Reeves, examined Ethan 3 days later. I sat in the waiting room while she conducted a comprehensive physical exam and took blood samples for toxicology screening. After 2 hours, she called me into her office. She said Ethan appeared to be a healthy 12-year-old boy with no signs of any serious medical conditions. She'd reviewed all the medical records from his previous appointments and found no consistent evidence of the ailments Rebecca had claimed. The symptoms described in various doctors' notes were vague and subjective, things that could easily be fabricated or induced through medication. She'd sent his blood work to a specialized lab that could detect a wide range of substances. Results would take a week. She asked about Ethan's behavior and emotional state. I told her he seemed happier and more relaxed since moving in with me. She said that was consistent with removal from an abusive situation. She'd prepare a report for the court, documenting her findings. The next several days fell into a new routine. I enrolled Ethan in a school near my apartment and explained the situation to the principal and counselor. They agreed to monitor him and report any concerns. Ethan started going to Dr. Foster twice a week instead of once. She said he was opening up more about the extent of Rebecca's manipulation and the psychological impact of being forced to play sick. Jeffrey called me on Monday morning with news. The toxicology results had come back and showed traces of ipecac syrup in Ethan's system. Ipecac was a medication used to induce vomiting, commonly used decades ago for poison treatment, but now largely discontinued due to potential cardiac risks. The presence of ipecac explained Ethan's frequent vomiting episodes at Rebecca's house. Jeffrey said this was direct physical evidence of medical child abuse. He'd immediately sent the results to the prosecutor's office and to Judge Osman. He expected criminal charges would be filed against Rebecca within days. I felt vindicated but also horrified. My wife had been deliberately poisoning our son to create symptoms she could then seek medical treatment for. The calculation and cruelty required for that level of abuse was incomprehensible. Jeffrey said the fundraising money would also be investigated as potential fraud. If Rebecca had solicited donations under false pretenses, she could face additional charges. The full evidentiary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Jeffrey expected Rebecca's parental rights to be severely restricted or terminated entirely. He said I should prepare for Rebecca to fight back aggressively, possibly by attacking my character or fabricating allegations. I told him I had nothing to hide and would answer any questions honestly. That afternoon, I received a call from Detective Lisa Mills with the Police Department's Special Victims Unit. She said she'd been assigned to investigate the medical child abuse case and needed to interview both me and Ethan. We scheduled an appointment for the next day at the station. Detective Mills met us in a comfortable interview room designed for children, with soft furniture and calming colors. She was in her 40s with kind eyes and a direct manner. She explained that she'd be recording the interview and that Ethan could stop at any time if he felt uncomfortable. She started by asking Ethan about his daily routine at his mom's house. He described a controlled environment where Rebecca monitored everything he ate, drank, and did. She kept a detailed symptom journal and would quiz him about how he felt multiple times a day. Ethan said his mom would give him white pills from a bottle without a label and tell him they were vitamins. Within an hour of taking them, he'd start feeling nauseous and would usually vomit. Rebecca would then become very attentive, holding his hair back and wiping his face, telling him everything would be okay. She'd post updates on social media about his bad days and receive supportive comments. Ethan said the positive attention from strangers seemed to make his mom happy. Detective Mills asked if Rebecca ever threatened him or told him what to say to doctors. Ethan nodded and explained that before appointments, his mom would coach him on what symptoms to describe. She'd tell him to mention stomach pain, headaches, dizziness, or whatever matched the specialist they were seeing. If he told a doctor he felt fine, Rebecca would correct him afterward and express disappointment. Ethan learned that reporting symptoms made his mom happy and saying he felt healthy made her upset. The manipulation was methodical and psychological. Detective Mills asked about the fundraising money. Ethan said his mom had shown him the donation page and explained that people were helping them because he was so sick. She'd told him they needed the money for medical bills, but Ethan noticed they never actually seemed to have money problems. Rebecca had bought new furniture, taken a vacation to Florida, and purchased expensive handbags, all while claiming they were struggling financially. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Detective Mills thanked Ethan for his honesty and said he'd been very brave. She told me she'd be forwarding her findings to the prosecutor and expected charges would be filed within 48 hours. She'd also investigate Patricia Webb, the CPS worker who dismissed Dr. Foster's initial report. If Webb had failed to properly investigate due to her relationship with Rebecca's sister, she'd face professional consequences. 2 days later, Rebecca was arrested at her house and charged with child endangerment, medical child abuse, and fraud. The local news covered the story, showing footage of Rebecca being led out in handcuffs. The headline read, "Mother accused of poisoning son for social media sympathy." The story detailed the fundraising page, the fake illnesses, and the ipecac poisoning. Rebecca's social media profiles were flooded with angry comments from people who donated money and felt betrayed. Some of them organized a group demanding refunds and considering a class action lawsuit. Rebecca's sister posted a long defense claiming Rebecca was being framed by a vindictive ex-husband, but most people didn't believe it given the toxicology evidence. The story went viral on local news sites and parenting forums. People expressed outrage that a mother could harm her own child for attention and money. I kept Ethan away from the news coverage as much as possible, but some kids at school had seen it and asked him questions. His counselor worked with him to process the public nature of the situation. The full evidentiary hearing took place the following week. The courtroom was packed with observers and media. Rebecca looked defeated, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit because she'd been denied bail pending trial. Judge Osmond heard testimony from everyone involved. Dr. Foster described her initial concerns and decision to break confidentiality. She testified that she'd filed complaints about Patricia Webb's handling of the case and believed the CPS investigator had failed in her duty to protect Ethan. Webb was called to testify and admitted she'd closed the case after a brief phone call with Rebecca and hadn't conducted a thorough investigation. She claimed she hadn't realized the severity of the situation. Judge Osmond reprimanded her sharply and said her negligence had put a child at continued risk. Webb's supervisor testified that Webb would face disciplinary action, including suspension and mandatory retraining. Dr. Reeves presented her medical findings confirming Ethan was healthy and the toxicology results showing ipecac in his system. She explained that chronic exposure to ipecac could cause serious heart problems and potentially death. Rebecca's repeated use of this substance on her son constituted severe abuse. Detective Mills testified about her investigation and the evidence of fraud related to the fundraising campaign. She'd traced how Rebecca spent the donated money and found that less than 5% had gone to actual medical expenses. The rest had been spent on personal luxuries. The prosecutor handling the criminal case testified about the charges Rebecca faced, which now included wire fraud and theft by deception. Jeffrey argued that Rebecca's parental rights should be terminated immediately and permanently. He presented the overwhelming evidence of deliberate, sustained abuse motivated by attention-seeking and financial gain. He emphasized that Rebecca had shown no remorse and continued to maintain that Ethan was actually sick, despite all medical evidence to the contrary. Douglas Crane offered a weak defense, suggesting Rebecca had become delusional and believed Ethan was genuinely ill. He argued for psychiatric evaluation and treatment rather than termination of rights. Judge Osmond rejected that argument. She said, even if Rebecca had convinced herself Ethan was sick, the deliberate administration of ipecac to induce symptoms demonstrated calculated abuse, not delusion. The judge terminated Rebecca's parental rights entirely. Ethan would remain in my sole custody with no visitation rights for Rebecca. The judge said Rebecca had betrayed her fundamental duty to protect her child and had instead used him as a tool for personal gain. The ruling was final and not subject to appeal except under extraordinary circumstances. Rebecca would face criminal prosecution separately. As the bailiff led Rebecca out of the courtroom, she looked at me with empty eyes. There was no anger anymore, just the collapse of someone whose carefully constructed false reality had been exposed. The criminal trial took place 6 months later. I attended every day of testimony with Jeffrey beside me as both a lawyer and a friend. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. They showed the jury Ethan's medical records, Dr. Foster's therapy notes, the toxicology results, and the fraudulent fundraising campaign. They called witnesses, including friends, who donated money after believing Rebecca's stories about Ethan's mysterious illness. Several of these witnesses testified about feeling manipulated and betrayed when they learned the truth. One woman broke down crying on the stand, explaining she'd donated $500 she couldn't afford because Rebecca's posts about Ethan's suffering had moved her so deeply. The defense tried to portray Rebecca as mentally ill and not responsible for her actions. They brought in a psychiatrist who diagnosed her with factitious disorder and claimed she needed treatment, not punishment. The prosecutor dismantled this argument by showing Rebecca's calculated behavior, the way she'd specifically targeted sympathetic audiences on social media, and her careful management of the fundraising money. Someone truly delusional wouldn't have been able to execute such a sophisticated scheme. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found Rebecca guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. Ethan and I sat in the courtroom gallery as the sentence was read. He squeezed my hand but didn't show much emotion. Dr. Foster had prepared him for this outcome. He'd told her he felt sad his mom was going to prison, but also relieved that she couldn't hurt him anymore. After the sentencing, several news outlets requested interviews with me about the case. Jeffrey advised me to give one statement and then maintain privacy for Ethan's sake. I did a brief interview explaining that I was grateful to Dr. Foster for having the courage to break confidentiality when she recognized the danger Ethan faced. I said the case demonstrated why mandatory reporters need to trust their professional judgment and why systems like CPS must take allegations seriously rather than dismissing them due to personal relationships. The interview was up nationally and sparked discussions about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and the need for better training for child welfare workers. Dr. Foster received both criticism and praise for her decision to violate confidentiality. The state licensing board investigated her conduct and ultimately determined that her actions, while technically a violation, were justified by the imminent danger to her patient. She received a formal letter of caution, but kept her license. She told me privately she'd make the same choice again without hesitation. Patricia Webb was fired from CPS after an internal investigation found she'd failed to follow proper protocols and had allowed her personal relationship with Rebecca's sister to compromise her judgment. Several other cases Webb had handled were reviewed, and investigators found a pattern of inadequate investigations. The agency implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar failures. The fundraising platform refunded all donations after Rebecca was convicted. Many donors chose to redirect their refunds to legitimate children's medical charities or to a fund set up for Ethan's actual education and therapy expenses. Ethan continued therapy with Dr. Foster for 2 years after the trial. She helped him process the complicated emotions of having a mother who'd abused him while claiming to love him. He struggled with guilt and confusion, wondering if he'd caused his mother's behavior or if he should have spoken up sooner. Dr. Foster helped him understand that children aren't responsible for their parents' actions and that he'd done nothing wrong. Slowly, Ethan began to heal. He made friends at his new school and joined the robotics club. He stopped having nightmares about being forced to take pills. His confidence grew as he realized his body was healthy and he could trust his own perceptions about how he felt. The fear that had shadowed him at Rebecca's house gradually faded. I quit my demanding job and found work with better hours so I could be present for Ethan. I'd learned the hard way that career success meant nothing if I wasn't there for my son when he needed me. We established routines that gave him stability. Dinner together every night, homework help, weekend activities he chose. My sister Lauren became a regular presence in our lives, providing another trusted adult for Ethan to rely on. She'd apologized repeatedly for not pushing harder when she'd noticed something was off, but I told her Rebecca had fooled everyone. 3 years after Rebecca's conviction, Ethan started middle school with no lingering health issues. He'd grown taller and more confident, playing soccer and excelling in science classes. He still saw Dr. Foster occasionally for maintenance sessions, but he'd moved past the trauma into a genuinely happy adolescence. He rarely mentioned Rebecca, and when he did, it was with a kind of distant sadness rather than acute pain. Dr. Foster told me he'd done the hard work of processing his trauma and was one of the most resilient kids she'd ever treated. I asked if the fact that she'd broken confidentiality ever came up in their sessions. She said Ethan had thanked her once for saving him, and that was the only validation she'd needed. 4 years after everything happened, I received notification that Rebecca was up for a parole hearing. I attended with Ethan, who was now 16 and wanted to speak. The parole board listened as victims and witnesses presented statements. I testified about the lasting impact of Rebecca's abuse on Ethan and the years of therapy required for him to recover. I explained that while Ethan was doing well now, he'd carry the psychological scars of maternal betrayal for life. Ethan took the stand and spoke calmly about his experience. He described living in constant fear of being poisoned, of never knowing when his mother would give him the pills that made him sick. He talked about the confusion of being told he was dying when he felt healthy, and the pressure to perform illness to make his mother happy. He said he'd forgiven her because holding on to anger hurt him more than her, but he didn't want her released yet because she'd never acknowledged what she did or shown genuine remorse. The parole board asked Rebecca if she had anything to say. She gave a prepared statement about how sorry she was and how she'd gotten treatment in prison and understood her actions were wrong. But her words felt hollow, rehearsed, rather than genuine. The board denied her parole. She'd serve at least 6 more years before becoming eligible again. Ethan and I walked out of the hearing room together into bright sunlight. He was nearly as tall as me now, a young man rather than the scared 12-year-old boy who'd been rescued by a therapist willing to break the rules. He'd survived something that destroyed many kids, and he'd emerged stronger. We drove home talking about his upcoming college applications and his plans to study engineering. He wanted to build medical devices that could help sick kids, a career choice that showed how he'd transformed his trauma into purpose. That evening, I texted Dr. Foster to update her on the parole hearing. She responded immediately, saying she was proud of Ethan and grateful the board had made the right decision. I thanked her again for everything she'd done. She'd risked her career and professional reputation because she'd believed a child's safety mattered more than rules. That courage had given my son a future. The story could have ended tragically if she'd followed standard protocols and waited for a system that had already failed him once. Instead, she'd acted, and in doing so, had saved his life. 5 years after Rebecca's sentencing, Ethan graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to study biomedical engineering. Dr. Foster attended his graduation party, along with Jeffrey, Dr. Reeves, and even Detective Mills, all the people who'd fought to protect him when he couldn't protect himself. Ethan gave a short speech thanking everyone who'd believed him and acted to keep him safe. He specifically mentioned Dr. Foster's decision to prioritize his life over professional rules, calling it the definition of moral courage. As I watched him laugh with friends and make plans for college, I thought about how different things might have been. If Dr. Foster had hesitated or followed protocol, if CPS had continued to ignore the warnings, Ethan might not have survived. Rebecca's escalation could have resulted in permanent injury or death. Instead, he was thriving, whole and hopeful. That night, after guests left, Ethan and I sat on the back porch watching stars. He said he wanted to give back someday by advocating for better child protection policies and training for medical professionals to recognize signs of abuse. I told him he already had, just by surviving and speaking his truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let abuse define you. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.